Welcome to this edition of Lindner Roundtable, a show where we put together a bunch of good anglers and thinking fishermen together at a table, throw a topic at them, and see what rises to the surface. My name is Dave Sand. I'll be the moderator, and joining me today from Lindner Media are Jeremy Smith, Mike Hayner, and James Lindner down there on the end. Okay, our search monkey and instigator here, Cornelius, has come up with a topic. He's researched this for us. We don't know what this topic is going to be, so we're going to throw it at the boys here and just kind of see what happens.
My question is, where do the topics come from?
Cornelius and his team of search
Can our
monkeys.
viewers make their own topics sometime?
Well, if they want to send in ideas for topics, sure.
Okay.
We're more than glad to consider them. It just has to make the cut with Cornelius.
Okay.
He's the head monkey. Okay. Our topic for today, this will be an interesting one, is seasonal fish location. Okay? Let me make a comment before I even throw it to you guys. I've done a lot of seminars over the years, and I've told people on this topic, people like to fish structure, the edges of things, drop-offs. They think that that's the key. And you know, you go fish a deep sunken island for walleyes in the fall, chances are it's going to be littered with fish and you're going to catch some big ones. You go fish that same spot in the springtime when the walleyes aren't even there and they're up spawning in a river miles up the lake, you catch nothing. Okay, your seasonal location is wrong. It has nothing to do with how beautiful the structure is. Seasonal location, fish change location throughout the seasons, and you got to follow along with them and then apply your fishing tactics. What do you think, Jared?
Well, yeah, fish do move throughout the course of the season, and that's always the big part to having success in fishing is being on top of fish and knowing where they are, where they're going, where they're coming from, where they're going to, and to be able to plan that. Fish aren't always predictable. Of course, daily weather can influence their movement and the time of year, and you might think one thing and it's different, so you always have to continue to search and find out where they are. It's nice to always have a good general frame of reference, knowing, like you referenced, Dave, in the spring, Current is a great location to go find walleyes in the spring of the year, and if it's your first time out, it's the opener, it's been a cool spring, you may think that the fish are going to be around the current. Well, maybe they spawned earlier or later and they've started to disperse over the flats or they're congregated in another area. So usually for me it's about looking at a location that seems to have the right type of habitat and forage or cover for that particular species of fish at that particular time of year, and then experimenting from there. But having that little base knowledge on where the fish should be at a certain time of year is a good starting point for any angling application.
Most anglers would consider, that their year starts in the springtime. Typically when the fish are starting to come up and spawn, that's when they come shallow and fishing interest starts to get high after a long cold winter. And Mike, you have a biological background. Probably the springtime and the spawning season is perhaps the most predictable time for fish location because they pretty much have to be in certain kinds of areas.
Right. Yeah, and that's one thing. Good thing about location is, once you fish a lake or types of lakes year after year, you can bank on them being there year after year in the same spots. And like the spring would be the most probably consistent one, I would say. Like take for example a big walleye. Like there's giant shallow rock flats where the walleye spawn. You can count on every spring. Without fail, those fish will be there, and they're going to stay there for, depending on the type of year it is, they'll be there for quite a bit after that. So it's like, they will be there in the spring. Same with bass, panfish. There's certain areas of the lake that are really suitable for them to spawn. They will be there every year in that spot.
Well, now you mentioned the panfish. Bass or panfish aren't going to be in the same spawning areas as the walleyes because they've got a whole different set of characteristics.
Correct. Yep. But once you've identified what the substrate they like to spawn in, you can
Those fish sweep out nests in a little bit softer bottom.
Right. And
Whereas walleyes are just broadcast spawners and they just dump their eggs on rocks.
and northern pike, you usually don't get them during spawning time because they spawn before
The ice goes out.
Before the ice goes out. So yeah.
And muskies are kind of a mystery because they spawn on shallow weed flats that are like 6 or 8 foot deep out in the middle of bays. And it's hard for people to locate them. So we have seasonal clues for finding fish early in the spring. And then when they're done with their spawning and they just start to distribute back out into the lake, now they start looking for food and developing habitat. And when you're looking at post-spawn dispersal, James, that becomes one of the more challenging times of the year.
I think, a location is, and the willingness for anglers to use their electronics is really the critical thing to go find fish seasonally. No matter what, there's a lot of different environmental factors that really determine fish location. There really is. Like in spring, we just came from the spring. The fish just came from their spawning habitat, and they start gradually moving out. But the interesting thing is when you look at any given body of water, it has certain structure. The big main lake points, the big sunken islands, the biggest flats in those lakes, those are the biggest food shelves in the lakes, and those are where those fish are going to gravitate to throughout the summer. And the thing is for you as an angler, is to use your electronics, because electronics determine where the bait fish are. Jeremy stated, well, you can have the best structure in the world, and if there's no bait fish there, the odds are there are not going to be any fish there. It's just the way it is, and there's a lot of different forage abundance is changing in the lake. You may have shiner spawning, you have crayfish moving around, you have big insect hatches, different things that's going to really shift these whole populations of fish in the lake that are following. They're more or less grazing on this food that's available in this lake. But you as an angler have to be willing to move around, use your electronics, and that's relatively simple. It is. A lot of people say, well, the walleyes are always here in June, second week of June. Well, the problem is the walleyes didn't know that. They only know one thing, where the food is at, and they're following food. That's why you can go to so many different bodies of water. And I've seen this actually in one of my seminars. I have a lake, and I actually go through the seasonal, following the fish seasonally. See them in spring, you see them in late spring, summer, fall, and in winter. And what's really interesting, at the last slide, I put up all of them. And everybody who looks at the map goes, holy mackerel, at one point in time, the fish are all over this lake. That tells you a lot, because at one point in time, those fish were moving from this spot to this spot to this spot, to the wintering spot, to be back up into in spring into their shallow water zone. So the fish are using the whole lake. You have to be willing to go out and find them. You really do.
Mike, to you, in the case of a walleye, the walleye might be feeding on minnows in the spring, and then there's a time let's say like in May in our part of the country, when mayflies hatch out of the deep mud basin, far from so-called classic structure, miles offshore, and walleyes move out there to feed on them. Some people might say that makes no sense. There's no structure. That's where the food is.
Exactly. Yeah, you're going to have some that are going to stay up shallow, feed on the minnows, feed on some perch. You're going to have others that are going to go way out to that deep and find the bugs and eat on them. So you got, like Jimmy was saying, you got fish going where the bait is, but they're in all parts of the lake. So.
And that isn't only walleyes, that's
Correct.
smallmouth bass, and there's a lot of other fish that are feeding on those
So
big
there's-
insect hatches.
Environmentally, there's sort of an ebb and flow. I mean, a lake is a living thing, and you have bait fish populations rise and fall. They become abundant, and they kind of disappear, and the fish look for something else. Weeds start to flourish and grow and thicken, and then in the fall they die off. And big fish like muskies, like Jared, they move all over the lake, relating to rocks, weeds, suspending. Say like early, let's say like after the spawn, it's not unusual for muskies to go out and suspend.
Yeah, that's a good food source. Typically, the water hasn't gotten to be so warm yet that the tulibees can still be somewhat near the surface. It's a good medium for muskies to be at a comfortable temperature, tulibees to be at a somewhat comfortable temperature, and that's a good source of food at that particular point in time. A lot of the bait fish that made it through the winter before, or maybe there's not as many of them as there was, say, in the fall, so that food supply is diminished, and tulibees are a good source of food, and they might happen to be abundant, and they happen to be the right size for that particular fish to feed on. But I mean, it really is all fish using different habitats throughout the year, and coming back to the whole food thing. It's just that fish, they do follow food, and they take advantage of the most abundant food source at that particular time. It seems like they know what's happening and where it's going to happen, and they tend to position themselves where it's
Say
gonna
like
be.
in the case of muskies, if you were going to go for suspended muskies from that, late spring, early summer
Yep.
type of tactic. You would probably be trolling out in open water to cover
Yep.
water
Yep.
in areas where you saw suspended baitfish on your electronics. But then at some point there's going to be a environment's going to reach a point where the weeds start to flourish, a lot of baitfish up shallow, and that shallow water habitat becomes very good. Or the muskies, for some reason, decide they're going to now go up and they're going to feed on shallow rock piles or something. And your tactics and your location totally change from
Big
what
time.
you did 3 or 4 weeks before.
Yeah, absolutely, and it can change even in the course of a day. Not all fish, in my experience, do the same thing at the same time all the time. There's always a few exceptions within the population of fish using different types of environments within that particular body of water. So yeah, if you get a nice warm spell and the weeds really start to grow fast, certainly the fish can move up shallow. And again, it's experimentation with angling. You get out on the water. You've got this idea that I've had success open water trolling, and you try it, and maybe it worked yesterday, but you're out there for a few hours and nothing works. Well, it might pay to go check out a nice shallow weed flat. Maybe there's fish there, maybe there's not. Well, maybe I should go look at some rocks and just see where the fish are, because as much as you think you might know about where the fish are, I don't feel like you can ever really. They know something that we don't. They know where they want to be. They go where they want to go, and there's nothing inhibiting them from doing that. And so you just have to continually experiment and see what works best, and use your best judgment. When this isn't working, what might be the next logical step in the process to catching them?
You get a lot of southern reservoirs where there's shad, for instance, as a forage. And summer temperatures may get so hot that the backs of the coves just don't host any fish. They become oxygen poor. And the bait fish and the big fish get out of there. And they're kind of like dead zones. You don't catch them there. But then when fall comes and the water temperature cools, those areas kind of get reoxygenated again. And you at least get a flurry for a while of shad and other game fish moving in and feeding in those kinds of areas for at least for a while. So it's real often classic to have a shallow water flurry at the beginning of fall. But then as the water cools even further, the fish tend to gravitate offshore and drop down on structures. This equates to most of the species, where they go for the stability of what is offered in deep water for temperature and oxygen. Now look at this, like one of the guys mentioned before, throughout the, you mentioned it, James, throughout the season, fish are moving all over the lake and reacting to the environmental changes. That's what they do, that's what they need to live, and you as an angler need to be able to do that as well. And the better you can react to what the fish are doing, you're on target to catch them.
The biggest thing is I think you can use your electronics to the maximum potential, and a lot of times you're better off to drive around your lake and spend a half an hour driving around and looking with your
Big time.
electronics
As
before
opposed to
even fishing.
fishing.
Because so many people says, well, I always catch them here in June. They pull out there and they start fishing immediately, rather than to sit there, drive around, you examine some shallow water habitat, mid-depth, deep water, a couple of different spots, and that'll give you a far better perspective on where you would probably be a good spot to start, I think, anyway. Because as we were saying, the fish are following the food, and that's gonna be the determining factor of their location,
And now let's, I'm gonna just take largemouth bass here as an example for something. Their habitat changes throughout the course of the year, especially where you've got weeds involved. And sometimes the weeds are poor, sometimes the weeds are very thick, and you may be a guy who says, I like to fish spinnerbait. Well, spinnerbait is good in some instances, but not in all of them. And we did a show, well, I think both of you did a show this year on punching, for
Yeah.
instance, the punching tactic, using heavy sinkers to get a big worm down and get it down through solid heavy cover. That's what it would take to catch bass in that condition. A spinnerbait, they may not do it at all. But yet there's another instance when the spinnerbait is a perfect tool for catching fish that are relating to scattered stumps or something like that. So all of this tackle is basically, it's your toolbox, and you have to use the right tool for the job. And you may have your own tools that are favorites, like a spinnerbait or a crankbait or a worm, for instance, things you really enjoy fishing. But when those tools are not the right thing to be using, you got to be able to willing to put them down and go do something else.
One thing talking about also, Dave, is seasonal fish location, and the peaks that happen throughout the season is one thing we haven't really talked much about, and there are definitely
point.
seasonal peaks that you want to take advantage of. Right now, it's when we're filming this, our lakes just froze over, and right before that froze over, that was definitely a seasonal peak for a number of different fish. Panfish, for example, starting to collect in a lot of the basins. If you were out there right before ice out and could drive your boat around over some basins, it's very easy to locate sunfish and crappies sitting in deep water, and you can go back there first ice and really have just a heyday of incredible fishing action. And it happens with a lot of different fish. The cold water period seems to be a period of collection for a lot of different fish in very specific locations. And it happens again also, of course, in the summer when you get the summer peak. Fish are very active. They might not be as concentrated, more spread out, but because the water's warm, their metabolism side, they're very active and striking different lures. And seasonal peaks are something you always need to pay attention to. And cold water seems to be, like we're experiencing right now, a big concentration point for fish, both spring and fall.
Even if you think about it, I was just thinking about that. Cold water, you were referring to the hot reservoirs, but cold water, like Jer said, the fish, you might go to a lake and all the bluegills and crappies are concentrated in a bowl of the lake, but you go to that same lake in March when there's still ice and you think the winter season, but those fish, you could go to that same spot and they might be totally gone. And you have to go somewhere on the lake with your electronics or whatever, cut a bunch of holes and find them in the weeds. So
Yeah, they're moving up, they're getting prepping for the spring.
right,
Ready.
so
They're
they
already
move early
repositioning.
ice to late ice. Is even
Yeah.
people don't think that, well, it's ice fishing season. The fish
Water's
are going to
cold,
be
the
here.
fish should be here,
They
yeah.
early ice to late ice. Those fish underwater, they
That's
move.
their instinctive urge to prepare and move toward the spawning areas and linger outside.
Or where there's green weeds starting to
Yeah.
grow out under the ice, and the
More
the
oxygen
critters
in
are using it more. The minnows are, so it's like there's a movement even at that time of the year that I don't think a lot of people take into consideration. So.
Yeah.
So once again, successful fishing is not just finding structure and it's not just throwing your favorite lure. It really is interpreting the conditions that are taking place in the lake at that time of the year. And that's evaluating the water clarity, the oxygen, temperature, the kind of forage that the fish are eating, the kind of cover that they might be using, the depth that they're in. And it sounds like an awful lot of science. You know why? Because it is. Because it is. Now, we're not out here just trying to throw scientific terminology at you, but trying to tell you the importance of becoming part of that environment and understanding what's going on. And once you do that, you've got a good handle on the seasonal fish location. And then once you're in the area, then you can try your different bag of tricks for catching those fish. But we always keep the seasonal location of fish and the transitions from season to season in mind, and it helps us stay on fish consistently, and hopefully you'll catch more and bigger by doing that. Well, I think that's about it from the Lindner Roundtable this time, and we will catch up with you next time with another intriguing concept on the sport of fishing. Thanks, guys.